All right, let's make a slot seam. So we're gonna grab two pieces of fabric, put them front sides together. This particular fabric, can't really tell the difference, so it doesn't really matter. And then you're gonna have a strip, but we'll get to that in a second. So first thing that we're gonna do is line up the raw edges just like we would with a regular plain seam, but instead of sewing regular stitch, we're gonna baste stitch. So the stitch length should be between 3.0 and 5.0. And then I'm gonna do a regular seam allowance of 5/8 inch. So from the stitch line that I'm gonna make to the raw edge, it's gonna be 5/8. So I'm gonna stitch down the fabric, and basting is pretty quick because the stitch length is so long. And we're not gonna back stitch. That would defeat the purpose of basting. And I'm gonna leave a little bit of a tail at the end of my stitch, just so it doesn't come unraveled. So there you go. There is a plain seam using a basting stitch. All right, so now we're gonna press it out like we would with a regular plain seam. Gonna open up that seam we just made and press it out with the iron. This is cotton fabric, so I'm using steam to press this out. Pretty high heat setting. Just want to press that open. So I made a 5/8 seam allowance. So on the back here, when you fold it, when you press it open, it's going to be 5/8 plus 5/8 of the fabric, the width of the two raw edges pressed open. And that's going to be 1¼ inch. So I made my strip of fabric and a contrasting fabric 1/4 inch or 1¼ inch wide, and the length of my strip of fabric is the same length as the fabric I used to sew the plain seam. So I'm gonna put on the back side of my fabric here the strip face down. You're gonna see the width of that strip is gonna be the same width of those two raw edges together. The 5/8 but plus the 5/8 is 1¼ inch. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna sew 1/4 inch from the seam I just made on both sides, and I'm gonna use a plain stitch, 2.5 stitch length, 2.5 millimeters. I'm gonna do the back stitch and sew all the way down and back stitch it again. So this is gonna be the permanent stitch. So I'm stitching 1/4 from that center seam on the right side. I'm not using any pins. There really isn't going to be any slipping issues with this, with my machine. Alright, I'm going to back stitch here. And then I'm going to flip my fabric around and sew on the other side of that center seam that I made. Same thing, 1/4 inch. 1/4 inch is about in the middle of one of the legs on my presser foot. So I'm lining up that center seam with the middle of one of those legs. That'll give me about 1/4 inch seam allowance. So same thing, back stitch, and then move forward. Now I'm going to back stitch again. Alright, all that's left to do is to take your seam ripper and rip out that basting stitch. You can use scissors, but I've had a lot of times where I accidentally cut my fabric with scissors, so I'm using my seam ripper. And being very careful not to accidentally puncture a hole in my fabric. I think it's just a me thing, but I like to be a little bit more meticulous about this, so it took a little bit longer. So I need to cut off those threads, those extra threads with my thread scissors. Clean it all up. And then all those loose threads from the basting stitch, I'm gonna remove those, clean that up. And there you go. You got your strip of fabric, contrasting fabric, stitched on the back, and then when you open it up, you can see it. This adds a neat little level of detail on a garment. So there you go. That is your salot seam. Thanks for watching.